Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar on the Inclusive Computing Classroom with me, Sarah, as the man, as your host, and Catherine Elliott is your presenter, who I'll shortly introduce. I'm the CAS, one of the CAS community outreach managers and I'm responsible for the North East, Yorkshire and Cumbria. I oversee the CAS communities and support the CAS community leaders in those areas. This webinar is part of the CAS Virtual Showcase, which is a 2-week window of webinars designed to support the CAS community. During the session, please use the question window on the right-hand side of your screen to ask questions. They'll come straight to me, and then I'll either ask Catherine halfway through, interrupt her, I suppose, if it's a question relevant to what she's talking about, or I can ask questions at the end as well for her, but don't use the chat box, use the questions. All attendees are in listen-only mode. The top of the window has an orange rectangle which can be expanded or collapsed. If you're using social media today, and that'd be great if you are, and you're on Twitter, the hashtag for the event is hashtag CAS Virtual 20. We also have Facebook groups, a primary one and a secondary one. It would be great if you could join those and maybe share some of your experiences from some of the sessions on the CAS Virtual Showcase. For now, I'll hand over to Catherine. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. So welcome to the Inclusive Computing Classroom. So I'm Catherine Elliott. I work for the Sheffield e-learning service, and I'm also a CAS community leader for the Sheffield region as well. And basically, I've been working with supporting schools with technology for a long time now, and probably spent the last 15 years looking at how we can use technology to support learners with special educational needs and disabilities. And when the computing curriculum was announced in 2013 initially, then a lot of teachers in special schools kind of came up to me and said, well, what do we do in this setting? And so ever since then, really, I've been looking at how we adapt the computing curriculum to make it accessible to as many users, to many learners as possible. So today I'm going to talk to you a bit about what actually makes an inclusive computing classroom. What are the things, some simple things you can do to make it inclusive? Now, I think this session was advertised as Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2. There are lessons here which are absolutely useful beyond that as well. So don't worry if you stumbled in and you're not a primary teacher. I'm on Twitter as Catherine Elliott, and the hashtag Send Computing is often used in these things as well to further the discussion, as well as the virtual CAS hashtag as well. So let us begin. Inclusion is a really tricky subject in some ways, because people have very different ideas of what does inclusion mean. And really what I'd like you to think about is think about the children in your classroom. And I imagine, you have lots and lots of lovely individual children who come from very different backgrounds, have different interests and lots of different abilities. And I think sometimes we can be very quick to look at what are the barriers and what are the problems that our children with particular needs and disabilities face. But I think it's also important to think about what are their strengths as well, and what are their passions and interests. Because if we look at the computing classroom and some of the things that might be barriers, so some people just might not be interested, and they might be rubbish at following instructions, have poor literacy, but some of these are also strengths. So your pupils who are excelling in computing, who might have really good literacy skills, reading and writing, they might be able to understand abstract concepts quite well and follow instructions beautifully, might be the ones who struggle a bit with creativity. And when you ask them to do something a little bit different, they might find that quite difficult to do. You might have pupils whose literacy is poor, that they find reading difficult, they can't write very accurately, but actually they're incredibly creative and they love working as a team and they love computing as a subject. And again, other pupils who might hate working as a team, might be very good at working, on their own with attention to detail. And so actually we can look at all of these things, and we should be looking at our children as individuals and how we can help all of our children to excel and enjoy computing as best as we can. And if we just look at one of these things, for example, following instructions, what's interesting is obviously you might have a child with a specific sensory difficulty or learning difficulties. They might be hearing impaired and therefore following verbal instructions is quite difficult. Or they might have learning difficulties and poor working memory. They can't hold all that information in their heads. They might have ADHD and be distracted from what the instructions are. But actually, you might have a child in your class with English as an additional language who struggles with instructions with complex language in them. You might have a child who's simply distracted because there is a wasp in a room, or there's a dog on the yard outside and they're paying no attention to what you're saying. Or you might have one of the children who has a regular guitar lesson in the ICT school and they come in halfway through the lesson and they don't know what's going on. And the sorts of things that can support one of these learners will actually support a lot of them. So if we make sure that there is a written form of the instructions somewhere on the board or on a checklist, that you add image support to help them make sense of it if their reading is poor. And all of these things will help a wider range of learners. And this is where I'm coming at it from the moment. And I've been reading quite a lot around inclusive design. Lovely book here called Mismatch by Kat Holmes, which looks at basically disability as a mismatch between our interactions with the world around us. And it's not that one person is disabled, it's just that the world around them isn't designed for them at the moment. And by designing a diversity of ways to participate, whether that's in products or websites or in the classroom in the way of learning, that helps everyone have a sense of belonging. And for me, the inclusion side of it is making sure everybody in your classroom has that sense of belonging. So it's not putting them in a corner with a differentiated worksheet to do that's completely different to everyone else, or out of the room completely because they can't engage with it. And sometimes there have to be very specific interventions for children with very specific learning difficulties or disabilities. I absolutely accept that. But in a mainstream classroom where you have children with lots and lots of different abilities, we can help make everyone feel like they have a sense of belonging by having lots of ways for them to interact with the learning. And that's what we're going to have a little look at today. And some of this basically just comes down to great teaching. If you are a great teacher and you use excellent pedagogy, then you will be more inclusive in your teaching. And this report came out very recently, actually, from the Education Endowment Fund, evidence-based education on great teaching. And they've put together a whole load of advice about what is great teaching. So I recommend you go and have a look at that. Assuming these slides will be shared. And so I've had a look at, well, what is inclusive computing? And so some of these things, and I don't want to teach you to suck eggs, but some of these things is about really good pedagogy that is applicable in all subjects. But we'll have a little tour through some of these as we go. And I'm going to spend a bit more time on some of the more computing specific things. So let me know if there's any questions so far.
Nothing so far, Catherine.
Then I will carry on. So the first thing, and actually this is at the heart of a lot of it, is making sure we're reducing the cognitive load on our learners. Now, I could spend the whole time just talking to you about cognitive load and what that is. At the bottom, there is a link to an NCC quick read on this. So if you want to find out a bit more about it, do visit that. But essentially, we can only hold a certain amount of things in our working memory before it becomes overloaded and we can't take in anything else. You'll know probably if you've sat in a number of these over the day, there's only so much information you can take in before it feels like that's your limit. And everything that we learn, there's a certain amount of germane cognitive load that's just how difficult it is. And some things are more difficult than others. But there's also this extraneous cognitive load that comes about with how we present the learning. And we can reduce that. And this is really important for children, particularly with learning disabilities, because often they'll have a poor working memory. So where you and I could hold a lot more things in our head, in our working memory before we've had enough, some children might only be able to hold one thing in their head before actually they're overwhelmed. So making sure that we deliver information in smaller chunks and revisiting that and make sure that that's well embedded before moving on. Using familiar context, and I'm going to come back to this later when we talk about unplugged activities, but actually if I teach you about algorithms by getting you to write down the instructions for making a cup of tea, and you're a year 1 pupil, well, writing is going to be difficult, so that's already a whole load of things you have to think about that's nothing to do with the concept. But also, if you've never made a cup of tea in your life because you're 5, then that adds extra pressure to the learning. And so by using familiar context, this will help reduce cognitive load. It's really important to teach the key vocabulary explicitly. If you can provide word lists of algorithm, program, input, output, animation, all the things that you're going to be covering in computing, this will really help children to be familiar with those concepts beforehand. Or you might have displays around the room. There's some lovely computational thinking displays from Barefoot Computing. And at the same time, teaching key skills explicitly and well helps with reducing cognitive load, because we all know there are some pupils who get to year 7 and they still struggle with logging in and finding their work. And if you've taught that well and repeated it and got routines in place, then that can help. It's not always easy to do, but it will help them concentrate on the learning in the classroom. Using algorithms to create an algorithm of how you log on can help with these things. And making sure you're breaking down the instructions, as we talked about before. So kind of at the heart of a lot of these things is about reducing the cognitive load on our learners. As I spoke about routines, so actually if whenever you are in the computer room or you get the laptops out or the iPads, you do the same things in the same way every time, you establish a routine and it becomes habitual and pupils don't need to think about it so much. So logging in on, we're going to do this, we're going to practice this, we're going to get this sorted. Accessing their work, well, do you go to the same shared folder every time? Do you save to the same shared folder every time and have the same naming conventions? And as this becomes habit, this will help your learners, all of your learners, but particularly those who have additional needs. When you're using technology, do you have the same routine to hand out the headphones and then hand them back in again? A pet peeve of mine is headphones without the wire wrapped around both earpieces. It's a complete nightmare, but you can practice that. Make a game of it, who can do this fastest, and get those little routines sorted. And that helps them with expectations. This is how we work when we are working with technology, and it will help tremendously with any pupils who need very clear expectations and boundaries and routines to help them settle. Part of this as well, excellent pedagogy is around questioning. Actually, you know, the traditional model is ask a question, somebody puts their hand up and answers it. But for any pupils who have slower processing, they need more time. And simply by giving them more time, and I'm aware most of you will know all this anyway, but just, you know, thinking about, well, what's the time I give to answer this question? I use technology to help with this. So this is fantastic. It has QR codes for pupils to answer multiple choice questions, and you only need one mobile device to access this, or just getting them to write it on a mini whiteboard or to draw a picture. Peer instruction is fantastic. You provide a question and some multiple choice answers on the board or on a piece of paper. The pupils think about their individual answer, and then they discuss their answer with a larger group before deciding on what the right one is. And that's really good because you can then engage learners with lots of different abilities. You can engage the learners who would never put their hand up because they're just too shy, but they have to take part in the discussion and come up with an answer of it. And there's some more information at the bottom there about peer instruction. Or simply agree or disagree with an answer already given. So some of these things are really simple, and I apologise if I am, you know, teaching you things you already know, but it's just thinking about them in computing context. Same with developing confidence, and a lot of this is about praise and reward, but it's also about making sure in projects that there's some degree of guaranteed success early on. And this can be done by getting pupils to modify existing programs, for example, or using templates when you're creating posters. And they have some level of guaranteed success, which will make sure that that confidence is there, then try things that are a bit harder. And I'll come to that in scaffolding in a moment. And allowing and encouraging failure. And this is where debugging is fantastic, because actually we need to say, well, we all debug. You know, no computer programmer produces perfect code the first time every time. So we have to learn to debug and find our errors, and we can celebrate that. And this gives permission to fail. And debugging somebody else's work, particularly a teacher, I did a report a couple of years ago where I talked to teachers in special needs settings about what worked in computers. And I had one teacher who said his pupils absolutely loved it when he was showing something and he deliberately made a mistake. And they'd be like, oh, sir, you've made a mistake, you've done this. And because the mistake wasn't theirs, they were much more confident about debugging that. Harness multimedia. If you're doing IT, you know, anyway, actually, you've got all these tools at your disposal. So provide content in different formats. Make sure you've got audio support and visual support, have videos, and not just text-based material. Make sure you've got images to support reading, or audio, but also allow the pupils to present their work. You know, you might have pupils who are incredibly creative and can tell stories, but they can't write it down, but they could create a beautiful animation. So all of these things as a computing teacher are at your disposal. A small thing as well is just, you know, making sure that your teaching resources are accessible. We all know somebody who loves to have, you know, that little funny gif of something flickering in the corner that's not actually relevant to what they're talking about. It might not be very accessible, and it might be a distractor to what they're learning. We like fancy fonts and beautiful colours, but actually that's not very useful for a lot of learners. And there's lots of guidance out there. So I have added it's a dyslexia friendly style guide at the bottom, and actually that's a really nice style guide for most learners. If you have a child with visual impairment, then there will be other adaptations you're going to have to make. But essentially, make sure your typeface is big enough for people to read, that you're using sans serif fonts that are easy to read, that you have good spacing between your lines, that you use lots of white space so it's not just really dense text to read. Make sure there's image and audio support if required. And consider things like the reading age of your text. You know, if you are using words which they don't need to know as part of the specific academic language, then how else can you phrase that? Certain things like italic and underline are much harder for some children to read. And the use of metaphor can be really confusing for some children as well. So just really clear language, clear resources, think about colours as well. Actually, if you have any colourblind children in your class, if you're using colour as a indicator of meaning, that can be a barrier. But making sure there's plenty of contrast between the background and the text. A pure white background is often harder to read off for some children than others. But actually, sometimes you can talk to your children if they have specific needs, find out what helps them. And if you're giving them some resources, then they can actually edit those themselves to be how they can access it. And at the moment with home learning resources, you know, it's really important that you're providing it in lots of different formats or in a way that they can access things in an accessible way. And part of that is using assistive technology. So assistive technology can mean, you know, rollerball mice and large keyboards and lowercase keyboards, but there's also a lot of assistive technology that's built into things like Google Docs, into Microsoft products now are fantastic, into iPads. So things like using dictation. Can a child dictate their words rather than typing them? Text to speech, can they have a large bit of text read to them? And this is all built in. In fact, I will add those links in there as well, where you can find out about some of those things. There's things like Immersive Reader in Microsoft Office 365, which is brilliant for children with dyslexia because they can focus in on the lines, they can change the line spacing really easily. There's a picture dictionary. When they hover over a word, it will read it to them. And, you know, as a teacher of computing, it's worth knowing about these things as well. Right, I'm going to have a little drink and Sarah can tell me if there's any questions.
No questions. Apologies for the people just a little break there. Apologies if you couldn't get in at the beginning. This will be available afterwards. I've just put that in chat as well, so apologies for that. But no questions so far, Catherine.
Okay, hopefully that's a good thing.
Yes.
Okay, so we're now getting into some of the more kind of specific things that you can think about as a computing teacher that will help. And as I mentioned in this report, the survey I did with teachers from special needs school, the thing that came up time and time again was physical computing. So physical computing is where you have a device that you can touch and feel and pick up and interact with. And the thing about physical computing devices is that you can get quick wins out of these. So you get some immediate output. So with a Bbot, you can press a couple of buttons and immediately you can see an output of it. And that's really motivating and engaging for children. And you'll know this with your, you know, the younger children, UIFS, having that tactile thing is really important. For a lot of physical computing devices, you have a sensory output. So where Scratch is very two-dimensional, you have something on the screen to interact with, and you might find it more difficult to relate that to the code. Actually, if you have a Bbot or a Probot, and I'll talk about the devices in a moment, then you might have light or sound or movement as an output. And children can make the connections between their program and the output in a more physical way. And it's a tangible device. And what's important about this is that you provide tinker time, you know, let them explore it, see what happens, ask questions about it. But physical computing is really, really good. The problem with a lot of this is there's not enough research out there yet about what works really, really well with SEND learners in computing, but we're getting more and more there. So in Hello World, if you've not come across Hello World magazine yet, then the link is there. Do go, it's a fantastic resource. It has so many articles written by educators about computing, and issue 11 was all about diversity and inclusion. So there are large numbers of articles in there about supporting learners with SEND, and one of which was around robots. So Hayley Leonard looked at some of the research that's come out about what works well with robotics and learners. And in terms of devices, so for primary, you know, there's a lot of stuff out there. The Bbot is still, I think, the king of physical computing in primary because it works and it's robust, and a lot of schools already have them. And if you have some and they're in the cupboard, then go and dust them off. I mean, I would even start using these into Key Stage 2 to look at, you know, repeats and selection and building in some activities there with learners who might struggle with block-based coding. So you can still create an algorithm that contains some more complex concepts like repetition, even if you can't program it on the Bbot. The Probot is kind of the next step up from that. And the Probot has a little screen, and it still has the Bbot commands, but you can add repeats. It has sensors, so it has a front bumper and a back bumper, and you can draw pictures, and it has a sound sensor and a light sensor, and that's really good for extending learning, but around a very familiar kind of bit of kit. If you can afford it, the Lego stuff is fantastic, the Lego We Do, and then the Mindstorms. But these are, you know, money is sometimes problematic. Caterpillar, wonderful. If you've ever used this, you can get it on Amazon quite cheaply now. And essentially, you just put the bits of the Caterpillar together, and it's a physical program. So the order of the segments dictates what it does. And so you've got a real instant connection between the sequence of the algorithm and the program. And that's really good for children to understand that. Lower cost things are things like the crumble control and the microbit, and they can be a little bit fiddly, because the problem when you start kind of connecting wires together and motors and lights is that you then sometimes have to debug the code and the physical system. But again, some learners find this really engaging and yeah, really useful to use. So that's physical computing. So if you've got physical computing devices, great. If not, see if there's a little bit in your budget to find a few of those. Okay. Most teachers nowadays in computing are using unplugged activities. And unplugged activities are fantastic for taking away some of the distraction of technology by learning about concepts away from a computer. And what's brilliant about it for learners with special educational needs and disabilities is that you can really harness those familiar contexts to reduce the cognitive load. And I'll give you some examples in a minute. And you can also, again, have these sensory approaches. So rather than writing algorithms, they can use movement, they can use dance, objects, music, in order to explore concepts such as algorithm, repetition, selection, variables. And it's much more immediate and easy to grasp than the abstract concept itself. What's important though, and this is where I think sometimes there are problems with this, is making explicit links to the programming tasks. I'll come back to this in a moment, and making sure you're using the vocabulary. So the examples I've got, these are two examples, and these are both on the Barefoot Computing website. Again, if you've never been, do go. And there's a series of activities that were designed for learners with special educational needs, and these are two of them. So the first one is a musical algorithm. Basically looks at creating a sequence of instructions, which are basically coloured cards, to play a tune. And you can teach about sequence here, because if you move the cards around, then you create a new sequence. You can get them to debug things, so debug the row, row, row your boat sequence if you give it to them with just one thing in the wrong order. The other one is a Lego algorithm, where you take pictures and deconstruct your little Lego construction, take pictures and then put it back together in reverse order to make your picture algorithm. And so tasks like these are really, really good with children whose reading might be poor, whose writing might be poor, but actually they know what Lego is, they know what music is, and so they don't have to think about the context overly, they can just learn about what sequence means. But if you never make any connection between that and any programming activity you do, then it just remains a music activity or a building a Lego activity. So for example, if you do the musical algorithm and then you go and do some programming with Bebop, when they are planning out their programs, you could talk about, well, do you remember when we did our musical algorithm? Think about what was important there. Did we have to put them in the right order? Well, it's the same here with the Bebop. We have to put it in the right order, otherwise it won't do what we want it to do. And then using the vocabulary there throughout both activities is important. So algorithm, program, sequence. And what you'll find with children with additional needs is you might need to do quite a number of these activities in lots of different contexts for them to grasp the idea of it. So you might need to revisit sequence in lots of different ways, because they're very different. Sometimes it's very difficult to apply the knowledge in different ways. But unplugged activities are fantastic with all learners, but particularly, yeah, the more sensory things are great for SEND learners. Any questions, Sarah?
Yes, we do have a question, and I'm just going to find it. Really not helpful, because we've got loads of really good. Here it is. So somebody's asked, she said, maybe it's a bit too broad and deep an issue, but could you say something about learners who present symptoms or have been diagnosed as having ASD or ADHD? That's quite broad.
Repeat that question again.
So just could you say something about learners who, well, basically ASD and ADHD learners? Do you want to come to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's really tricky because actually, you know, as somebody once said, you know, you meet one child with autism and you've met one child with autism. So although I'm talking about sort of general approaches to this, what you'll find is for some of these learners, things like following complex instructions is difficult. So supporting that process with checklists and with pictorial support is really useful. The harnessing kind of familiar context that will motivate them as well. So I've worked quite a lot with learners with autism in the past and with ADHD, and if they're not interested, then it's quite hard to engage them in an activity. So finding what interests them and using that as a hook into an activity is really, really good. But actually, you know, once they're engaged, a lot of learners with these needs find computing really engaging and really somewhere where they can excel. It's just giving them structure, it's giving them routine, and making sure that they know what's coming next and things. So talking about all those routines at the beginning, giving time to follow instructions. This is what we're doing now. We're going to do this, and scaffolding what they're doing along the way as well. So I don't want to go too much into the specifics because it can be very individual to a particular child, but all of these things will help children with those diagnoses, if that makes sense.
Yep, thank you. That's great. Thank you.
So 2 more things to cover. Planning, and this is something that traditionally we've done really badly in computing. So we go straight in and we program a game or we make an animation and the children don't do the planning. And actually it's really important that they do the planning stages. So using things like code cards to plan out programs, I'll show you examples of those in a moment, provide them with a planning template for complex programs. And what this gives them, it gives them time away from the technology to think about the algorithm and the program without the distraction of the technology there. And that's another thing I found, you know, some children with autism, ADHD, once they have the technology, then it's very hard to separate them from the technology and teach some new concepts. They want to interact very much with that technology at that time. So if you can get them to plan things first, then it will help make sure that the learning's there. And it supports decomposition, debugging and evaluation. So I'll talk about this in a moment. And even if it's not programming, if it's a multimedia project, actually still make sure you plan this like you would a literacy task. So looking at what a good one looks like, doing some storyboarding, thinking about the content, what are the features of these things, are all really, really important. And so it might just be in Key Stage 1, using some Bebop cards to plan out your route to get the Bebop from A to B. And what having the cards does is it gives them something to refer to so they can come back and debug it. Or they can look at it and go, well, how could I improve that? So they've got a record of that plan. If you're doing something like Scratch Junior or Scratch or Logo, then doing a more complex plan. So looking at what the algorithm is, what does that look like in the code? It helps them decompose it. So thinking about, well, what do I need to do here? What does this sprite do? And what does this sprite do? And that helps children make sense of a more complex project. So you could, with learners who are finding it really difficult with a complex project, you could give them some planning for some of it and they just fill in some bits of it. But having all of this will really help them come back and be able to improve on their project. This also really helps in terms of assessing where they're up to and checking the understanding of your learners, because actually without assessment, some formative assessment, then it's quite hard to support our learners appropriately, because you need to know what they understand and don't. And by planning, this will help indicate if they're working in a group, you can see what bits they've done. and inputted on. Okay, last thing to talk about, and actually I'd say this is probably one of the most important ones, is around scaffolding tasks and varying the ways that children can participate in the learning in the classroom. And there are a number of models we can use for this. And a lot of this is built around the Use, Modify, Create framework, which really looks at computer programs and say, well, actually, if we use a program that's a fully working program, then we can interact with it in that way. And then we can start to modify one and then create our own. And you're moving the learner from something that's not theirs to theirs and having greater responsibility and less scaffolding. Prim builds on this, I'll talk about this, and also templates, you know, having a template for making a poster. Because if you give a blank page to a child, any child, to be honest, they find it difficult, particularly a child with learning difficulties. If you're using Scratch, for example, there are so many different code blocks in there, and it's overwhelming. So what we can do is not start at the create side, but we can go back and have a look at it. So in terms of Prim, there's a link there to find more information. This is a lovely framework to look at. Well, rather than just make a program, we can predict what a program does. So we can look at some code. If you have a look at the code on the right-hand side, what's going to happen in this program? Well, it's going to tell a joke. They can then run the program to check that they understood it and see how the code actually looks in practice. They can investigate, and what's lovely about these first three steps as well is that they can be done away from the computer. So if you have a child that is distracted by technology or who has a barrier that logging on takes half the lesson, actually they can do some learning away from that. So you can give them some code to investigate. Well, what does this bit do? What do you think this does? Can you find an example of repetition? Can you find an example of selection in here? And then they can go on to modifying their activities and then finally making their own. Now, it doesn't have to be done in this order. You can dip into this. I'm going to show you some examples in a moment of what this might look like. The other thing that you've got is Parsons problems, and these are used a lot in secondary. And basically, they give you working code that's all muddled up and you put it in the right order. So what this might look like, well, you might have some children, you might want all children to be working on a similar project in the classroom. So this is a project around drawing shapes. And some children might have a working program, so on the left-hand side, that they just run and find out what it does. They could look at the code first and predict what it does and then run it. And then they can start to modify it. And by modifying it, this doesn't mean changing any blocks or adding new ones. It can simply mean changing the numbers. So repeat 3 times. What does it do? What happens if I change the steps and make it bigger or smaller? What happens if I change the number of degrees? How do I change the pen color? And all of this can be done, then you've got that idea of guaranteed success so that the children have created something. And then some children might stay there and that's what they do in that lesson, and they can have a look at changing the background of the sprite. Other children might go on to have an activity where you provide them with the code, but they have to put it together in the right order. And then they can investigate what each bit does. And then they can move on again to debugging. Well, what's wrong with this code? Can you make it better? And then finally making their own. There are lots of examples of Scratch projects like this at sheffieldclc.net/Scratch. So if you're using Scratch in the classroom, there are lots of ways of doing this. You can do this with a Bebot as well. You can start off by showing them a Bebot program and getting them to predict what it does, or to debug a program, or to investigate a program and get you to tell you where it's going. So all of these things are really, really useful approaches for children. And that, oh yeah, that's the other thing. So, and you can use these approaches with other parts of the computing curriculum. So you can get them to debug an animation or a branching database. You can get them to modify a template for a poster, or edit some existing video things, or investigate the features of a successful pictogram. and improve a given artifact. And by having all these different ways to interact with things rather than just making stuff, we come back to this thing where you are providing a diversity of ways to participate, so that everyone has a sense of belonging and they all have different ways of accessing the learning. That's, you know, that one of the biggest things you can do is just giving lots of ways to interact with things, lots of different media, and making sure things are accessible. So my final slide is about, well, where can you find more information? Because this was a really quick introduction. So some of those pedagogy quick reads are worth reading from the NCCE. So that's good computing pedagogy and how you can use that. They're not SEND specific, but most of these approaches are really, really vital for supporting learners with SEND. There is a CAS Include working party, which is all about improving access to computing for people from diverse backgrounds and abilities. And if you want to get involved in that, you can find out more information on the Computing at School website. There's a whole website, sendcomputing.info, with resources around SEND computing, mainly around the computer science side. So it has information about how you can support learners with Scratch or other physical computing devices. It has ideas for unplugged activities. It has links to research and other things as well. So that's a really good place to go. And finally, there is a course. This is the course I wrote. It's a mouthful, Creating an Inclusive Classroom, Approaches to Supporting Learners with SEND and Computing. And this really goes through all the stuff I've just said, but in a bit more detail, and some activities for you to reflect on what you do in your classroom. And that's free if you sign up through the teachcomputing.org website. So I really recommend you go and do that. So lots and lots of stuff there. A lot of it you should be doing anyway. It's just thinking about how you harness it to really be as inclusive as possible. So thank you for listening, and Sarah can let me know if there's any questions.
Thank you. Just lots of people saying how brilliant this is, Catherine. So thank you. Very informative. We've got good stuff, loads to take back to school with. So thank you. That was absolutely brilliant as always. Thanks everybody else for joining us today. But yeah, particularly thank you to Catherine for presenting. My personal highlights are, well, just everything really. I love physical computing, so I like all the physical computing ideas that, you know, not necessarily just to be used down in Key Stage 1, but, you know, with SEND learners, with SEND learners, so I like that. Take those ideas away. Any highlights that you feel that you want to share on social media from today, that would be great. On the CAS website or in the CAS Facebook groups, the primary and secondary ones. At the end of this webinar, a short survey will appear on the screen. We'd be grateful if you could take a minute to complete the survey. And in about a week's time, you'll receive an email with a CPD certificate confirming your attendance at this session. A recording of this webinar will be available on the CAS website in about a week, I think. We hope to see you at the other sessions in the showcase. There's lots of them, so you have a look, and we'd love to see you there. And please continue to spread the word about the first ever CAS Virtual Showcase. So thanks for joining. Thanks again, Catherine. That was brilliant, and hope to see you all next time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.